to write fast enough to capture the things people were saying, I couldn't read it. If I left gaps thinking I'll fill that in when I write it up, my memory wasn't there. And I was like, oh dear. Now, what do? Just started a new company, really like my boss. This is not a good moment. Every single one of my weaknesses that comes from dyslexia is directly linked to a strength. And a strength which has given me a very successful career in corporate finance. And a strength that continues to make me a very good coach. I really think we need to stop looking at what I can't do and start looking at what I can do. How am I great? Where am I amazing? And how do I lean into that?
Hello and welcome back to the Smart ADHD Podcast. Today it's all about the challenges and opportunities of building a business that aligns with your unique ADHD brain. And I'm excited to welcome Mike Cole to the show. He's an ICF-accredited coach and qualified accountant who has navigated a journey from leading multinational teams in multi-billion-pound corporates to empowering solopreneurs to build profitable, sustainable businesses. In this episode, we're talking about unmasking and how you can build a business that works for you. Mike shares his experience with dyslexia and working with ADHD clients. Now, it was such a fun conversation, so interesting. Mike was amazing. And so let's get on with it right now. Hi, Mike. Welcome to Smart ADHD. It's great to see you. How are you doing today?
Really well, thank you. And very excited to be here. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, thanks, Mike. We've been chatting, toing and froing on LinkedIn Messenger. I knew I wanted to have you on the show because we've had a few conversations, but it's taken a little bit of a while just because of many things. But we met, I think it was earlier this year. We might have met before that. I can't remember. This is my ADHD brain. The LinkedIn Live conference. Am I right there, or have I got that wrong? Maybe it was something else. Maybe
So was that Uplift Live? Uplift Live?
Uplift. What did I say? Yeah.
LinkedIn Live.
Very Uplift Live.
Uplift Live.
That's it.
Yes.
I almost got there.
And then at Tube Fest. We were at Tube Fest together as
That's
well, where
right.
you gave an excellent talk. Really enjoyed that.
Yeah, that was fun.
And it now feels like I've been stalking you, but we bumped into each other in Newcastle as well at an event. So yeah, a number of moments, almost touch points through the year that maybe have led to this. So that's exciting.
That's right. Yeah, that was Atomicon in Newcastle. So we bumped into each other. And I think this shows the importance of real life human-to-human kind of meetings and communities and all that kind of stuff. I think that's so important. But I wanted to get you onto the show to talk about unmasking, particularly unmasking your ADHD. Now, I'm right in saying you don't have ADHD, but you are a coach and you work with many people, some of which have ADHD. Just before we dig into this, what is your background into looking at this aspect of things, unmasking? Because I know you used to work in corporate and you have dyslexia. So what's your history here?
You're right. As far as I'm aware, I don't have ADHD, and yet it's going to be possible that within the traits that show as dyslexia and maybe other elements in my life, maybe there's elements there I don't know. But as far as I'm aware, I don't have ADHD. I do have a confirmed ADHD diagnosis within my immediate family, and I'm also aware that there is, or I'm led to believe there is a genetic link. If it's in one of your children, I guess you're always questioning, where's that come from? Could it be my side? Yeah, potentially, don't know. But my background or my interest in neurodivergence particularly comes from dyslexia. And I was luckily enough diagnosed back in the 90s when I was at school, in a time when dyslexia wasn't really known about or talked about. And I was lucky to be picked up because of my sibling, who was more obviously or more evidently dyslexic, and just from the way that the studies came out. And so I was put forward to be, studied, reviewed, tested, and they came back and said, yeah, here you go, Mike. And at the time it was, here's some extra time, good for you, off you go. And I think it's really taken a lot longer to understand how that affects me differently from other people. And so when it comes to unmasking, the idea of hiding that dyslexia through my working life and the reasons why, the benefits of masking, and then ultimately the reasons to consider unmasking that and the benefits that's where my interest has really been. And I think a lot of that journey is as relevant for someone with ADHD or indeed autism or a different form of neurodivergence as well. So that concept I'm hoping will be really relevant for the audience.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting. We were talking just before we started recording about this wonderful word, this very hopeful word, comorbidities. I'm joking here, but people with ADHD and in fact, it could be autism or dyslexia, it's usually not just one of these things. It's usually a concoction. So it could be ADHD and dyslexia. So the conversation we're going to have today is going to be relevant in many different ways, but particularly when it comes to unmasking. And for me, I think I don't know whether there's an element of shame in there in terms of hiding my ADHD. Certainly there are stigmas, there's misconceptions as what other people think about that. But for you, what was your experience? Because as you said, you've known for a while, since the 90s, that you're dyslexic, but you haven't, in a sense, embraced that. You haven't talked about that openly. You didn't talk about that in your work. So what's been that transition of unmasking? And what does that unmasking mean for you?
Yeah, so unmasking to me, I guess what is masking? I might find it easier to explain it from that perspective. And please, every listener, please be kind to me, because one of the things about being dyslexic is use of words, and choosing which word and forming that structure can sometimes be slightly more challenging. Masking meant not letting anyone know. And the reason that was so important was not showing weakness. And I personally think that's a lot about judgment. It's other people judging us and we judging ourselves. I think from a young age, we're encouraged to fit in. We're also, I don't know if we're encouraged, but we're quite good at pointing out where someone's different to us and picking on them as a result, whether that's at school or indeed through a corporate environment. And so unmasking to me is stopping needing to have the mask to pretend you are someone or something different to yourself. I think that is different from, I think you can cause offense and harm under the justification of that's just how I am. And I don't think that's okay. Does that make sense? So I think there's a bit about how we're more authentically us, and it's an overused word, but I think it's the right word, without being an idiot or being mean or being horrible to others. It's releasing the best bits of us rather than trampling down someone else. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. And that's a really nuanced answer, that, because it's not just as simple as, here I am, warts and all, and I'm sorry I'm not sorry because I just shouted at you. That's just the way I am, or whatever. So it is nuanced, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. And what works really well, say for you, Ian, might not work well for me. And if we're in an office environment that says we need to fit both of you, how do you do that? And actually, there are circumstances. I did some consulting with a company last year, and they had, with their finance team, they play the radio. And for some people, going into that office and hearing the radio play is going to be impossible for them to work and study. They'll want the quiet. For others, it really helps them and lifts them. What do? You can't appease both sets of people. I think that's where the nuanced discussion, if you don't recognize it's a nuanced discussion, you rapidly get into trouble. Same with office temperature, same with lighting in the office, whether someone wants blinds closed or not. There's so many elements that we quickly get into a form of conflict that can be hard to resolve.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So you, as I said, you were in the 1990s, you had the test, you find out you're dyslexic, you were working in a corporate environment, you are now not. What was that kind of transition, and how did you get to the point where you were a lot more open about being dyslexic?
Yeah, so for the last 5 years, I've been doing this coaching angle, having left the corporate environment. And through that coaching journey, as I qualified and gained more experience, there's a lot of self-reflection. And I think a lot of it became more and more apparent how, throughout my time in corporate, I'd lent into what makes me special and found ways around my weaknesses, my challenges. And I'd done that subconsciously, or I'd done that unknowingly, but it had really benefited me. But if I take us on a slight journey on that, the way my dyslexia shows up is three things. And about 2-3 years ago, when I started talking more openly about having dyslexia, I talked about two of them, and I kept the third one very quiet. I'm about to explain why. So my memory isn't very good. That's why I've been taking some notes as we're going, and I will keep writing things down. That's a perfectly valid way of coming around the memory problem. My handwriting is actually really slow, which is why ordinarily I would be typing. For the purposes of this, we don't want keyboard noises, but the odd word jotted down is fine. But in my coaching, I take notes on a computer, I write them as I go. I just find that the most efficient way, and it's a really effective way. But the third is processing speed. And the thing about processing speed, what it really means is it takes a bit of time to consider something if you've not considered it before. And it's the worst. The shortest way of describing that is to say you think slowly. Can you see any scenario in which someone saying you're a slow thinker is a good thing? Because what comes to mind when we say someone's a bit slow, that was a phrase certainly back in the 90s and early 2000s. They're a bit slow. they're a bit dim, don't we? A bit not with it. And then there was another element. So there's this idea of, I see those only as things that can hurt me. I don't see how saying that is a positive. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
Then we've got a world, particularly I was in some of the biggest companies in the UK, and it was a privilege to be in them, and I had a great time. And please don't think they did anything wrong in this. I think they were representative of the environment. But if, as a trainee going into those, if you were weak at something, they made you work on it till you were good at it. Every year, every 6 months, in fact, you had an appraisal that looked at what you were doing, what you weren't doing well. If you had something in the not good box, you then needed to improve that over the next 6 months, 12 months, whatever. And you did particularly well if you could write something in that I need to improve this area, and next time say, look at this, I'm really good at this now. And I played this game, I was very good at it. So I deliberately put something in the not very good box, which I could then spend time developing and getting better at. So it was true, but then I could be good at it. What I never did is put something in the not very good box, which I know I can't change. My memory is not good. I do memory training things to improve it, but we're talking from a low bar to a very slightly higher low bar. I will never have a good memory. And I've come to terms with that. That's part of the unmasking journey for me, was coming to true terms with it. It'll be okay. And actually I have a story I can share about that very journey. But it was coming to terms with this then helped me move forward. But I felt I couldn't share that. I couldn't, in that corporate environment, explain those weaknesses in a way, because I couldn't tick them off and say they're no longer weaknesses.
That makes sense. And were you, presumably part of that was you were, I don't know whether the word is afraid, but you were maybe afraid of the judgment of, because those things that you say, they are negative in the world's eyes. Poor memory, slow thinker. And we can reframe them. We can change the words, considered thinker. We can change that. But ultimately, people out there in our minds, they're going to judge us. So what was the transition from that? That's quite a low point, quite a negative way of looking things, perhaps a true way. I don't know. How did you then move to where you transition to where you currently are in what you're doing now?
Yeah, and I think that is quite, just on the negative viewpoint, I think that is a negative viewpoint of it. And whether it's fair or not, that's how I felt at the time. And through the 16 years I was in the corporate place. And it was less about people judging me and more that it would be held against me when it came to opportunities. And for example, while I was at Rolls-Royce, I had the opportunity to read through their published, an unpublished report. It was massive, hundreds of pages, huge privilege. And I got to go into a room full of very senior people where you all get to know each other across, I think it was a weekend, special activity, special project. Absolute honour to be picked. If I'd have said to them, guys, actually I find reading particularly tiring, they'd have very kindly given that opportunity to someone else, because that was in my best interests to not tire me out over a weekend because it's not playing to my strengths. And yet the opportunity that would have deprived me would have had a direct effect on promotions. That makes sense? Yeah, so I think by doing, in their view, the right thing, potentially, and this is hypothetical, I don't know that this would have played out in this way, but I think if they tried to do the perceived right thing, that would have hurt me. And so one of the key things to me was, I'm conscious I've not actually answered your question, and now I've forgotten it. But one of the key things for me in this was to show where I'm really good and to perform very well. And if I can perform very well and nobody notices the things I struggle with, why tell them? If nobody notices that I struggle to remember things, or that it takes me more time to read, then why bother telling them about it? I discovered a really cool thing. So it takes me longer to read because I have to read every word. So here's the thing. When one of my children was having a diagnosis for dyslexia, they pointed to this sentence, to a word mid-sentence, and it said horse. And they said, tell me about the horse. And if you just look at the word horse, most people would be able to tell you it was a brown horse and had a saddle on it or something. They can read a number of words around it. And I remember I was in the room and I remember saying afterwards, you mean people can look at more than one word? Their brain will interpret more than one word just by looking at one word. My mind was blown. I was like, how? I have to look at every word. If I look at that word, I can see there are words around it, but I can't read them unless I move my eyes to the next word. Because I read every word, I read what is actually said. And because I read what's actually said, I can pick up the tone. I can pick up very clearly what they're actually saying. But I can also, because of the way my brain works, pick up what they're not saying. And there were a number of times I read key draft statements, and said things like, that sounds like you're trying not to say you're about to make 100 people redundant. And they went, how would you possibly know that? It doesn't say that anywhere in it. I said, yes, but the way it's phrased makes me think you're avoiding saying it. And they were considering that as part of the thing, and I did not know that that was something they were considering. So the fact that I could read every word made me actually really valuable, despite it seeming like a weakness area. Does that make sense?
That makes perfect sense.
And it's one of these angles that says, I can take something which is in theory a weakness, and there's actually a strength in it. So how do I use it to play into the strength bit while not hurting me for the weakness?
I think that is so important. I was at the International ADHD conference, and one of the speakers was talking about the dichotomy of ADHD. And I suppose you could have the dichotomy of dyslexia in that there are all these traits. And from a psychological point of view, we tend to look at these negatively. So with ADHD, we would look at, again, poor working memory, executive function issues, procrastination, chronic procrastination, distractibility. But for each one of those, there is potentially a positive. And I know we're going to maybe talk about this later in this episode or in the other episode when you're going to come back to talk about. So it sounds like in your journey, in your brain, you were starting to see that it wasn't all negative, that there are positives, or that you could use part of the way your brain is to actually lean into your strengths. This is a tricky one, though, because I think, I can see how that unmasking happened, but for those of us who are afraid to reveal their neurodivergence or their ADHD, part of that, I think, is the way we see it, but also the way we're worried about what other people say. And you talked about your experiences in corporate. I worried with this podcast, and one of the reasons why I don't promote this as much as I should, I'll be totally honest here, is because I'm afraid about what people are going to say. I worry that, Ian's talking about ADHD again. Everyone's talking about ADHD. It's all these things. And so I had a lot of reservations in the whole idea of launching this podcast. But I also feel I have to do this, and I actually really enjoy it, and I love these conversations. So have you got any advice for those of us who are afraid to reveal their neurodivergence, their ADHD, particularly in the workplace, but and with people?
Absolutely. First off, this is a very personal journey. And so one of the things that I certainly am not very pro, is labeling. So if somebody has recognized ADHD, whether diagnosed or undiagnosed, do they need to tell everyone about it? I think that's a very personal thing. And if I have a slightly skewed version, which is to say, if you need adjustment so that you can be the best you, then it's worth talking about. If you can shape the environment you're in so that you don't need adjustment, you just can be the best you can be, then I don't think you need to be. You're welcome to tell people, but I don't think you need to unmask in that way, in part because I don't think you've got a mask on. I think if you're being you in the workplace already sufficiently, then I don't feel the need to go, oh yeah, actually. Does that make sense?
That does make sense.
I do have some things that will help concerning.
I won't interrupt you. You carry on, but you've maybe start to think, yeah.
Feel free to interject. I think, if I could use you as an example for a second, I think a bit of a reframe. When we think, is there any point me talking about it, or is it worth me getting involved in this because others already are? I think there's a real challenge around what resonates for other people. And the way that you talk about it will be different from the way that other people talk about it, or at least some other people, the way they talk about it. And so you will resonate with a particular type of person. And what if no one is talking to them? What if no one is talking in a way that they understand, or bringing the focus or the style that works for them? And by keeping that sort of quieter or more reserved, the reframe here, how is that impacting others? How are you holding other people back because you're not being more confident about talking about it for those that will resonate more strongly with this? Does that make sense? So my reframe, if someone was thinking, I find it very hard, or I'm very worried about unmasking, step one is I would genuinely ask the question, do they need to? If they can shape their world in a way that's going to work for them without, and they see it's not going to add any particular benefit, don't bother. Because I think you can break the mask. Maybe that's the difference. Maybe that's like the mask dissolves rather than taking on off and being like, this is really me. But I think where we're holding ourselves back, and what I realized through my dyslexia journey, actually through the coaching self-reflection development elements, I realized that every single one of my weaknesses that comes from dyslexia is directly linked to a strength, and a strength which has given me a very successful career in corporate finance, and a strength that continues to make me a very good coach. Those weaknesses, I talk of it like a coin, and the weaknesses are one side of the coin and the strengths are the other, and I can't have one without the other. And no matter what I do to those weaknesses, whether I file that down to make it look pretty, or try and file it away, or whether I colour it or something to try and make it look exciting, I've still got that weakness side. But what if I just turn the coin over and put all my effort into using my strengths? And what I found in my corporate world, as I got thrown into job after job, because I was really good and doing a really good job, they kept chucking bigger, more challenging problems at me to solve, and I kept solving them. And that's how my brain works, how my dyslexia brain works. I was very good at doing that. I think in those moments, most people wouldn't have cared. If I'd have said, by the way, I'm dyslexic and that's why I can do this, I think they'd have gone, oh, fair enough. Here's another problem. Go again, right? You're up. We've got this other issue. Off you go, Mike. Go solve that. And I don't think that would have mattered. And yet, for me personally, I don't think showing my hand of weakness, which I can't do anything about if someone wants to come at me for, I still don't see an upside of putting that card down on the table. So I don't see why I would say I have a processing speed challenge or a memory challenge unless there's an upside to me. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Yeah.
As a coach, it's easy for me to talk about that and encourage people to lean into what makes them special. As a finance employee of a large multinational, I would explore the stuff I needed help with or change with, but I would not necessarily do the other bits.
That's a really helpful way of looking at it. And I've been thinking about, you mentioned you're not a fan of labels. And I totally see what you're saying there. And I think for me, the label, if we want to call that ADHD a label, I think that has been immensely helpful to me personally because it gives me a vocabulary. However, saying that to the world I have ADHD may or may not be particularly helpful because everyone has different ideas of what that actually means. But to me, that's helpful. But so I think it's important to see that distinction in the same way, like you could have gone into your workplace and say, I need glasses. I'm wearing glasses because I'm short-sighted. And that people probably don't necessarily need to know that. But you've made those adjustments to yourself for wearing the glasses. And is that maybe a good analogy?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a raised desk when I was in the office, and it was slightly raised, but it was raised because of my height, meant they should just give me a slightly higher desk. I hadn't really realised that it was going to crick my neck if I hadn't have used that, but after 10 years, 12 years of not having a raised desk, then having a raised desk, I was like, wow, this is more comfortable to sit at. It's quite visible when you've got a raised desk, and yet also that was just a help. In those scenarios, just like I wear glasses just like you, Ian, yes, absolutely. And if it helps you understand the problem, and I think ADHD in particular, there's a lot of language currently helping people understand the kinds of traits or the kinds of things they may or may not experience. And appreciate, again, ADHD, like dyslexia, like autism, is not you have ADHD and therefore this is true. It is within these, you may experience some of these linked to the fact you have ADHD. Yeah. I want to share other things. Is that all right? The first is writing. I need to write the second one down or I'm going to forget it, because that is my brain. Guess
That's
what?
A good thing. I wish I could do that, writing down at the same time. I struggle with the multitasking.
And it's jumped. It's gone. Hopefully it's going to come back, but let's see. So the first is writing. So let's just use my handwriting as an example. When I started, where was I? I was at Experian, actually, and brilliant company, really enjoyed it, had amazing opportunities and did really well. I really loved being there. When I first arrived, I was a project manager, really. They called it a project accountant. And my job was to go and take notes on key status meetings, make sure everything's moving forwards, chase down actions, that sort of thing, and send a summary around to everyone. And the default standard was, here's a notebook, here's a pen, write it up, you type it up afterwards and send it around. And I did that for a week, maybe two, and realised I was in real trouble. To write fast enough to capture the things people were saying, I couldn't read it. If I left gaps thinking I'll fill that in when I write it up, my memory wasn't there. And I was like, oh dear. Now, what do? Just started a new company, really like my boss. This is not a good moment. Do I go and see my boss and say, let's do some training? Send me on a handwriting course training, maybe a memory training, maybe I could learn some form of shorthand. Maybe I could go and ask for that. And I think I could have asked for that, and I think I would have got help. What I did instead is say, what am I good at? I'm quite a quick typer. At the time, probably 50 words a minute. I was doing a speed test with the kids the other day, 70 words a minute. I was pretty impressed with 70 words. I don't think I can sustain it. But I can type fast enough, even back then, to capture what people were saying. So I captured it live. And then at the end of the session, immediately, when everyone was stepping up to leave the room, I would literally press send and send the notes around. And it meant that not only were my notes more accurate, I saved all the write-up time, which was probably worth a day a week of time. And everyone had their notes probably 2 days earlier. And I remember going back to my boss and going, I literally have a day free. What do you want me to do? And then being pretty mind blown. And I use that as an encouragement to say, I really think we need to stop looking at what I can't do and start looking at what I can do. How am I great? Where am I amazing? And how do I lean into that? And then maybe the question around support comes, what do I need to help me do that in the best possible way? Because if I can be that special strength, then basically that's where I'm going to change the world, or that's where I'm going to add all the value or be incredible. So that's where I'd like us to, the world, that's where I'd like the world to be focusing.
Definitely. And there is that journey that we have to do. We can't expect the world to make a journey. We can hope and we can maybe help and facilitate other people, but we have to make that journey ourselves. And you've made that journey. I'm on that journey. I know that listeners and viewers are on that journey. Inevitably, you're going to look at a lot of the traits of ADHD, autism, dyslexia. You're going to look at those probably in a very negative light and get quite depressed or angry, a range of emotions. But looking at those positives, that dichotomy, that yes, there are things that you can do that other people can't. And that's what you mentioned for you. And a lot of people with ADHD tend to be quite intuitive. It sounds like you were quite intuitive with words, like all the meaning behind the words, which is fascinating. I've noticed that I can be very intuitive. I can read. This is not always a good thing. I can sometimes read the expression on someone's face, and they might, for example, they might be trying to look interested, but I know actually they're not interested because I've learned, unfortunately, over the years. Mike, what we're going to do, because this has been so fascinating, but I'm also looking at time. I would like to, if that's okay with you, we'll finish this episode now, and then all the other questions that I wanted to ask you about this episode, we're going to do as a second episode. And then the other episode, we're just going to have to do later. Is that okay with you, Mike? Because there's so much, and I want to focus on the next episode on the strengths. And I also want to ask you about those strengths, but also there are other kind of areas that I think we could really do with your insight on. So is that a good thing to do?
That would be great. I'm very happy to do that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, because there's just so much. And you were right, Mike. Mike was saying just before I pressed record, there's quite a few questions here. There's quite a few, I was there thinking, yeah, no problem. We'll be able to talk about all that bit. You were right.
I think there's quite a few questions, but I think more importantly than the number, there's a lot of good questions that I think are very useful for people to explore and hear. And this is all part of a broader conversation, isn't it? And so they're great to explore.
Yeah, exactly. So today we've been focusing on that masking, and we've been talking about this journey of maybe accepting the way we are. And this is really all about building a business that, what would you say, like building a business that works for you, that's you-shaped. So in the next time that Mike comes back, we're going to talk about those strengths and a few other things to do with that. So thank you, Mike. It's been great to have you on the podcast. How can people find out more about you? We've got all the information in the show notes, but where's the best place for people to connect with you?
I'm always up for connections on LinkedIn and Instagram. As you say, the details are in the notes. Please come give me a follow. And if I can plug my quiz as well, all about thriving, whether that's thriving as a solopreneur or thriving as a small business owner more broadly, or as an employee, different quizzes, but all doing the same point. So please do come along and have a look, and the links are in the show notes, I assume.
Definitely do that. Definitely do that. I've done the quiz and I was very impressed. It was really insightful. It gives you, I think, there's many different types of ADHD as there are people with ADHD. I keep saying this, but one of the things that I often need help with, I think, is that self-reflection, or that's how we view ourselves. We're not always so good at that. So all of these kind of things, particularly this quiz, I think is really useful. Thank you, Mike. It's been great. Thank you so much for watching, for plugging us into your ears, watching on the YouTubes. Really appreciate that. But until next time, I encourage you to be smart with your ADHD. Toodaloo.